All right. Well, welcome everyone. So we're going to kick it off now with Mike Berman discussing outputs.
I'm going to share my screen. Can you tell me if you can see my presentation there? All right, I see a thumbs up. All right, elevate your outcomes, how measuring the right things improves lives and the bottom line. So to get us started here, just a quick trivia question. How much does a polar bear weigh? Anyone have an idea?
As much as he wants.
Good guess. The answer I'm looking for is enough to break the ice. So this is an opportunity for an icebreaker. And this is actually one of my favorite icebreakers. I think it's a great way to just kind of get things moving and help people talk. But one that I really like is, I'd actually love it if you take the next couple of minutes, look around you, and find an object. Find something that you think kind of represents who you are. You can go off camera to go find this, but I'd love it if you just found something and we can come back and we can have a quick conversation and you can just say like, here's the object, here's how I think it represents me, and just give your name. And that's kind of a nice way to get to know something about the people here. How does that sound? All right, I've got my object, so I'm just going to sit here, but I'll just wait a couple of minutes. So maybe at 5:14 here, we'll come back and we can do a little popcorn.
What are we supposed to be working on?
So right now you're just finding an object that you can talk about and talk about how it represents who you are. So this is just a quick icebreaker, just to quickly kind of get to know you a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, so we are at 5:14.
Yeah, you missed this.
I'm sorry?
I was saying Trent missed the setup of how much does a polar bear weigh?
Yes. Enough to break the ice. That was my cringy way of presenting an icebreaker. So does anyone have something that they'd like to start us off with?
That's a big sign. Yeah.
I do.
Darren, yeah, I see your object there.
So this is Dougie from a kids TV program in the BBC, but it shows in Australia, and he basically runs the equivalent of kind of like a scout troop, but it's not the scouts; it's just like a kids club. And he's a teacher and a carer, and he's wise and he's humble and he's big and round. And I like to think that all of those apply, and the latter is definitely accurate, big and round, and the others I aspire to. But he's an all-round nice guy, and kids love him, and I hope that my kids that listen to me someday and learn from me. I've got two young girls, 6 and 2, and this is one of their favorite shows, hence why we've got Dougie.
I love that. Do you have someone that wants to go next?
I can go next. I have my coffee mug from Agile Open San Diego 2017, but if there's any small benefit of what's going on for the last 20 months, it's the ability to join Agile networks like this in Colorado, which would be very hard to reach from Southern California. I shouldn't complain if Damon could make it, right? But I have a ton of these from all of the different Agile groups that I go to, and I always leave better than when I got there, and meet some really clever people. So don't think of the pressure, you guys.
I think I need that message a lot right now.
I can go next, and I think I may have to hop. I got to do a kids pickup, but this, if it's not so blurry, it's just like puzzles. It's like logic games and stuff, and I think it represents me because I like taking on challenges, and if they're games and can be fun, I'm even more engaged. And this one, it comes with like a little eraser, like a marker, magic marker that you can like erase, dry erase for each of the puzzles. And so I also think that's like me, where it's like, oh, that didn't work out. Well, we'll just like erase that one and give it another shot. So I'm definitely into puzzles and games and challenges.
Very cool. Mine is similar. I'll just do my chessboard here, because I like to just set up puzzles and solve them throughout the day. And we just had the World Chess Championship, if anybody follows chess. And so sometimes I'll set up a particular position from it and try to work through what I think the next best moves are. It's a nice way to keep my mind active.
Simon, you got something?
Yeah, this is an Inuit carving that I have on my desk. Trout. It's made of soapstone. Reminds me of the outside. It reminds me of life. It reminds me of water. And yeah, I like it.
Wonderful. And if you don't want to share, it's fine. Any more shares?
Trying to get my computer to actually respond to me, but anyway, yeah, here goes mine. That's my cowbell, because what do we all need a little bit more of? Cowbell.
All right, that just brought me back about 2 decades. I love it. Awesome. Well, I can share mine. If you can, it's kind of hard to see. It's this kind of weird thing that you get when you climb Mount Kilimanjaro. They give you a certificate for reaching the top. And this is actually really meaningful to me because it was something that I actually didn't think that I would ever be able to do in my life. It wasn't even something that was ever on my radar. Back in college, I had a terrible illness. I was actually supposed to be disabled for the rest of my life. And so for me, kind of my goal was really just to kind of get a little bit healthier, and I wanted to climb a little bit of smaller things. So I was kind of looking at the mountains around Colorado and thought, one day it'd be really cool if I climbed a 14er, right, a 14,000 foot peak, or what is that, around 3,500 meters for our Australian person. And so that was kind of my big goal, my desired outcome. And eventually, though, as I got close to climbing almost all of the ones that were in Colorado, I realized that I could do a lot more and I could keep growing. And Kilimanjaro became something that was fully within my ability. And so that's something that's really important to me. Actually, my purpose or my why is to help people push the boundaries of what they believe is possible so that they can achieve things that are bigger than they dreamed possible. Right. And so that kind of fits into this space. And I think the same way about business, right? I really want to help people achieve a way of business that is a lot better than they dreamed possible through these continuous iterative improvements. So one of the things that I really would like out of here, so you'll kind of see, I'm going to keep referencing this presentation the same way that I would a product, in the same way that I'm talking about outputs and outcomes. I'm going to talk about this presentation in the same way. And here's some of the desired outcomes that I hope I'm going to get through this conversation, right? I'm hoping that by the end of this conversation, you discover a sense of purpose for driving towards better outcomes that extends beyond this conversation. Right? I think this is actually a very difficult conversation. And at least for me, it's been years of trying to understand more about it. But hopefully through this conversation, I can show you why it's so important. I'm hoping to clear up some of the confusion around outputs, outcomes, and value, what those actually mean. And I'm hoping that you have a good idea of how to create outcome goals and what's needed to make them succeed. I also hope you have fun. That's really important to me. And I would like to get your feedback. This is actually the first time that not only am I presenting this topic for the first time ever, this is the first time I've ever done kind of an hour-long presentation period. So I'm still learning on how to do this and how to make it better. So you're really helping me, and I will take good, bad, whatever feedback throughout this process to try and improve this down the road, because I'd really like to keep presenting this in the future. All right, so I'd like to start with a story. I'm a big believer in stories, by the way, so you'll see a number of stories throughout this. So something really exciting happened to me. Back in June, I got my dream job. My work could literally save lives, livelihoods, and the planet. Not only that, they wanted to pay me the best salary I've ever had, offered me extra vacation time, and my pick of the team I wanted to work with. Like seriously, like I had found my dream job, and a couple of weeks ago, I quit. Now, I'll be honest, I can't help wondering what they thought. He's a millennial. He's entitled, lacks loyalty, impatient, right? These are the things going through my mind. And I had to go through a process. I had to kind of think for myself and say, how do I see myself? And I'm like, I've started 3 different businesses. I launched a wearable payment company on par with Apple Pay and Samsung Pay. I fought the disability I told you about earlier to graduate from college with honors. I've climbed over 70 mountains over 14,000 feet. When I went through all that, I'm like, no, I don't think I'm lazy. I don't think I'm entitled. I don't think I'm impatient, right? Those things are hard and a lot of times unpleasant. So why do you think I quit? It's because of what my company measured. So what a company measures becomes the most important thing, right? It's how people define their success within a company. And this company measured predictability. And for good reason, right? They had government contracts and they wanted to know what we would build, when it would be done, and what it would cost. And they're not alone, right? Most companies focus on predictability metrics. It's the normal. If you can predict the future, there's no risk, and your stakeholders have more confidence. And it's a lie, right? Because here's the thing, when you're trying to save the world or anything that requires multiple people and more than a month of work to achieve an outcome, it requires innovation, collaboration, and experimentation. And those things are not predictable. So when the goal is predictability, right, you can't innovate. It's too unknown. You can't experiment. You've got deadlines. And you can't really grow as a team because that's too inefficient. So teams become siloed. They focus on process to improve efficiency and to be predictable. All of the things that make work fun and mentally stimulating, that gets cut, right? And people stop asking if the work they're doing even matters, because clearly what matters is the work itself. They become focused on outputs. Here's the thing, right? Going back, I wasn't focused on outputs though. I was focused on outcomes. I wanted to change the world. I didn't need motivation when I started. I had it. I just needed the space to go figure it out and how to do it. But I was so bogged down by process and so disconnected from whether the work I was doing was making any real impact at all, that I felt like my soul was being crushed. And it only took 4 months. I'm lucky, right? I'm privileged to be able to quit, to be part of the Great Resignation, right? Not everybody can do that. Not everybody should do that. But right now, right, latest Gallup poll shows that 85% of people in the world are unengaged in their jobs. Right? The vast majority of people are spending their precious lives doing something they don't care about, that's bad for them, and it's bad, very bad for business. The good news is that great outcomes can have wonderful impact on employee engagement and business results. And my hope is that it only takes an hour to start a change. So that's my story. I haven't shared that story very often, hardly with anybody. And I want to see if you connect with that story. I want to understand a little bit from you all. If you've experienced kind of this idea where you came into a job and you thought you were going to be doing something big and you just didn't quite deliver on that promise. Didn't quite feel like you were really impacting the customer you were hoping you would. Right?
Are you looking for volunteers and comments, Mike?
I am. Yeah, I'd like to hear if you can relate to that, or if there's a specific time you can think of that you can relate to.
Certainly can relate to it. Most of my career since mid-99, I got into IT for the first time, and I started off in testing, software testing, QA. And projects were traditional projects. 99 was, pre-2001 and the manifesto and everything. So pretty much everything was done traditional sort of waterfall type projects. And as a tester, and over the years becoming senior tester and test manager and program test manager, there's a timeline, there's a deadline, it's invariably immovable, stuff's late, testing gets squeezed, and then it's either work flat out or throw more people at it, or both, or cut corners. But even before I got into testing, my passion was to do the right thing by the people that were going to get it. So I used to be in banking and banking products and interest rates and all that kind of stuff for deposits. And it was like, just do the right thing by the customers. And, to me, it's just a moral thing. So in the world of software testing, it was still very much, about if they get what they need and it works well and it doesn't die on them and it's not awkward to use, then that's a good thing. And of course, like with projects, it's like, got to test everything and you got to cut corners and blah, blah. And it got to the stage where it became mechanical for me. The passion was still there, but it was like, is this one going to be different? No. And then, I discovered Agile in 2006 and I just went, oh, this just makes so much sense. And the focus is on actually, value and meaningful stuff. And so then I shifted my career into working in the Agile world and being around Agile people. And lucky enough to sort of like shifted my career, and I'm now an agility coach. And I'm experiencing the same kind of frustration because companies say, hey, we want to go Agile, and blah, blah, blah. And then in you go, and it's like, fix them, don't fix us. And we want them to be faster and increase their velocity or throughput or whatever it might be. So, yeah, I can't say the phrase same stuff, different day, because my daughter's around. She's got big ears and learns words very easily. But you know what I mean, right? Same stuff, different day. And then I think what promised to be a revolution and an evolution, I think that promise is still there. I just think the people don't get it, or they don't want to get it. And I think this is one of the things that drew me to heart of Agile, was the coming back to the simplicity of just increase your collaboration, deliver for learning as well as deliver for income, take time out to actually pause, to reflect, actually make small improvements. And the keywords in there, when Alistair first phrased it, I don't know if any of you have seen his technical document. It's like a 2 or 3 page PDF. I can share a link in the chat. But it's not just continuous improvement. It's across all levels in the organization, and that's key and that's critical, and that's what drew me to heart of Agile. So I'm still hanging on to the fact that there might be hope and that we might change the world slowly. And if I look back and think I've done my bit, and made a bit of a difference, then that's good enough for me, because I know I can't take on the whole world, but if I feel like I've made a bit of a difference, that's good enough for me.
Thank you so much for that story. Thank you so much for relating to it. I actually saw a lot of myself in that myself, right? That's one of the reasons that I was drawn to Agile. But this job I was talking about, it was supposed to be Agile, right? They talked about being Agile, but it still had that same kind of feel. I'd love to hear from everybody. I do want to make sure that I have time to go through everything. I'm probably not going to have time to go through everything anyway, but we'll see. But thank you. Thank you very much. One of the first things that I've seen a lot of, right, is there's a lot of nodding of heads, especially in the Agile community, when you say outcome over output, and people are like, yes, let's do that, right? And then you go watch them and they create outputs. And you're like, what's going on? How did that happen? So one of the things that I actually want to dig into a little bit is making sure that we understand the terminology of what's going on and why it's a little bit confusing sometimes too. Right? So there's some very simple definitions here. Right? An output is an amount of something, whereas an outcome is an end result. But I'll challenge you with a question here and kind of keep this one in the back of your head a little bit. So let's say you have a team and they do a bunch of tasks, complete a bunch of stories, and now they've got a feature. Is that an output or an outcome? Right? And that's where a lot of people get confused, right? Well, okay, we did a bunch of stuff. It's an end result. What is that? But there's one thing that's really missing from this outcome definition, and that is for whom, right? Who is this outcome for? And I won't hold you too long here. The answer is for the customer, right? And in my experience, I've thought about this question for years, and I've thought about every for-profit, nonprofit, charity, government organization I can think of. I can't think of any of them that don't exist because they're solving a problem for a customer, right? They may not understand the problem they're solving for a customer. That happens a lot, but they are still solving at least a problem for the customer. So a really good way to think about this is that an output is internal, right? It's something that the organization itself gets value out of improving, whereas an outcome is external. I wanted to bring this up too, because this is another area of common misconception, right? This is from the Agile Manifesto. This is one of those principles: working software is the primary measure of progress. And I often hear this misquoted as working software equals value, right? And that's not really the same thing. And it's usually misunderstood too when they talk about, well, what is working software, right? A lot of times we think of working software is, okay, it's gone through all its bug fixes, it's gone through QA, it's done, right? That equals value. And so a lot of times you see this idea of like, okay, if we just output more software, right, that's just naturally equals value. So a higher velocity, more value, more value. And that's not really true at all, right? And okay, I'm going to tell you another story. Take a moment for that picture. I love that picture. So a few years back, I used to work at Scrum Alliance, and we had an innovation day. And on the innovation day, all of our teams came together and we sat around and we spent about 3 hours kind of thinking about what are all the different problems that we'd like to solve. And then we formed teams around those things. And so we had about 5 hours to go solve a problem. And one of the problems that we were thinking of is, it's kind of boring to learn about Scrum, right? Maybe we could make it more fun. And we thought about it more and we thought, well, why is it boring? What's missing that's making it boring? We said, well, there is no fun educational game that you can play online, right? So, by the way, 5 hours is a very, very short amount of time, but we decided we were going to split up each of those 5 hours into 1 hour sprints. And at the end of one sprint, to talk about how fast this was, we had come up with an idea using Post-it notes. We had 4 Post-it notes and it had a picture drawn on it. And so each Post-it note kind of represented a puzzle piece, and you would win a puzzle piece by answering a trivia question about Scrum, just to add a little more excitement and interest. But we had to move so fast that all we had time to do was draw a happy face on these 4 Post-it notes. And we didn't even have time to write out the question. So we just ran around the room and said, hey, I got a question for you. Let me try and think of one. Okay, I got one, right? And we threw the question at them. And if they got it right, it was like, here's a Post-it note. Right? And we were just trying to validate for the customer, right? Is this fun? Are you enjoying this? And over time, right, we got better at asking the right questions and better at figuring out what kind of puzzle they wanted to solve. And at 4 iterations, we said, okay, now we got this idea. People are enjoying this. Let's go build the online game. So we had an output. At the end of all of that, an online game about Scrum. But there's something missing, and there's a reason I said this is an output and not an outcome, right? Can you think of what's missing here? I'll give you a hint. What's missing was the validation piece, right? So we had something, but it hadn't been put in front of a customer yet, and that's really the necessary part to say, what is the outcome? Because we don't know. We don't know what the outcome is. All we have is a piece of software until we can actually check and find out what's going on with it. And the funny thing is, the outcome that we learned is it's not fun, right? The game was only fun when it was actually done with real objects and with people, right? When we put it online, it was boring. It was like, who wants to play alone, sitting at home, doing this stupid little puzzle? And we actually found that it was a lot more interesting and valuable to just give people the instructions and say, hey, go play this with your team, rather than sit alone and play this game. Right? And here's a great example of how the outcome was, let's make an impact on the customer. Let's make sure that they're having fun and they're learning Scrum. And lo and behold, the answer was not software, right? It was something they could hold and actually work with. And that's kind of an interesting, cool thing when you start focusing on outcomes. It starts being so focused on the product itself, and it starts looking more at like, what are all the options you have available to you? I thought about this too, and I thought this might be important as well to talk about when we're saying outcome oriented. What does that mean, right? There's a couple challenges here because really there's two different goals that are happening. One is a desired outcome, right? That's the goal that solves a customer problem. So when you say, I want people to enjoy the Scrum game and have fun, right? That's what we want to happen, and that's what we want to see happen, which is very different than making sure that you're actually validating, right? So an outcome itself, in a general sense, is not necessarily good or bad. It's the objective result of the work that tells you if it was valuable. Does that make sense? I want to be clear on that. Like, it's one thing to try and get people to make sure they're validating and actually coming up with what's the outcome of the work we did, versus there's another aspect of it of what's actually the desired result that we're trying to get to.
It makes sense. And I think the differentiator, this is a conversation I had recently with a group of people, is that the desired outcome is based on an assumption that it will solve the problem. And the validation is whether it does or it doesn't. And for those of you who are familiar with RAT, riskiest assumption test, it's that kind of notion of, they'll love it. How do you know?
Yeah.
So you validate it, and then if they don't, great, it's a learning point, and then you pivot and whatever it might be. But it's the line. You could almost draw a line in there that's like, crossing the assumption boundary and testing the assumption.
I love that you said that. I just want to repeat that because it's such an important distinction, right? Because no matter how much work you do, until you actually put it in front of a customer and validate whether it's solving a problem or not, everything you're doing is based on an assumption, right? You don't actually know until you've done that step. Love that. Thank you. All right. So people who know me know that I have a big fascination with Elon Musk, and I kind of want to put it out there. That doesn't mean that I agree with Elon Musk. I hear this a lot. I'm like, oh, I heard this thing that Elon Musk said. And they're like, oh, you must love Elon. I'm like, no, actually, he's got a lot of things I don't like, but I'm so utterly fascinated by him. And one of the things that's really interesting, right, about SpaceX is that in order to work at SpaceX, you basically have to throw away the rest of your life, right? You are so focused. They are intentionally burning people out. It's really hard to work at SpaceX. And yet a lot of people do that, right? I talked a little bit about being a millennial and some of the things that people think about millennials. And SpaceX kind of proves that that's just not true, right? They've just kind of found the thing that makes millennials so excited that they're like, yeah, I'll drop life and family and kids and go work for SpaceX and throw away the next few years of my life to achieve these goals. And the reason that I think Elon Musk gets people to do that, he's so inspiring, is he's actually really, really wonderful at creating these amazing outcomes. Right? And so that's kind of what I want to focus on here. So SpaceX has this problem that they're trying to solve right now. This is actually what they're doing today, right? The problem that they're trying to solve is that the future of humanity is bleak if we do not pursue life among the stars. Right? And one of the things that they ask themselves is, well, why does that problem exist? Right? And they say, well, part of the problem is it's too expensive. And I highlighted expensive there, right? It's too expensive to go to space. So the outcome that they're pursuing is to reduce the cost of orbit to less than $100 per kilogram, so that more people can access space and make colonization of other planets economically viable, right? They have a hypothesis there that if they can get the price down to that point, it's actually feasible for people to go into space. By the way, if you go on a Falcon 9, they've got it down to about $1,700 per kilogram. So going down to 100 is a pretty significant leap for them. Another example, so this is Tesla. This is a past one. Right. So one of the problems that they were trying to deal with here is driving using fossil fuels is bad for the environment and it's unsustainable. And why does that problem exist? Well, partly because people have range anxiety with electric cars. So they stick with gas cars. It's hard to make that conversion. So one of the outcomes they pursued was achieve 400 miles in one charge with 2 superchargers. They can charge the battery in 20 minutes within that 400-mile range. Now that is a lot of numbers, and I don't want to totally focus on the number. What I think is really important there is that behind those numbers is a story, right? There's a reason why they're actually trying to accomplish this that is customer centric, right? They're like, really what they're trying to solve is range anxiety. And they think that if they hit these numbers, they can solve range anxiety. So what makes a great desired outcome? Let's actually talk about this. I think there's some principles here we can take. One, it's a hypothesis within a context, right? I think that's really, really important. You don't know that the outcome's actually going to achieve the goal. You think it is, but it's focused around a problem that you're trying to solve. Two, it's measurable, right? It doesn't have a lot of value if you aren't able to actually measure it and look at, what are the numbers? So it should have some numbers attached for you to actually say like, okay, so the work we did, is that moving us closer or further away? Like there's something tangible there. It's a noble pursuit to help an external customer, right? This is actually really critical. If you want to inspire people around your outcomes, it has to be something that actually has value to them in the long term, right? Like it's not very interesting to raise profit margins for a company. It is interesting if that profit margin helps you evolve into a new program that actually helps people, right? If you can actually see the direct impact that you're doing for people, people can really get behind that and rally behind that. It should be dope, right? And what I mean by that is that it releases dopamine. So I recently read this book by Simon Sinek, Leaders Eat Last, and he talks about how achieving certain metrics can release dopamine, right? And that's, so it's literally like, if you have the right kinds of metrics, you can actually make the workplace a happier environment. And I think what's really important to call out here is that one, they should be achievable, but two, they should never be a punishment, right? You shouldn't look at a metric and say, well, I didn't hit that, and that brings sadness. Right? It should be more of, it's a goal, it's an aspirational thing to reach. And that's where you kind of get that increase in happiness. And the last one here, and this is super, super important, right? It's validated with customers, right? And I want to say here too, right? It's okay to be wrong. Like it's fine if your hypothesis is wrong and you find out like we did with our game that, oh, actually online wasn't fun, because it's really about the learning opportunity. That's really the success there, right? You're learning what's actually valuable to your customers and you're getting better at that in the future. I'm going to pause for just a moment. Is there any thoughts or questions at this point?
Just to be clear, this is the front end desired outcome. You had a previous slide that talked about desired outcomes and then validated outcomes. So at least in my mind, I was differentiating that. And here we're talking about desired outcomes that in my mind are yet to be validated, but are you kind of lumping them together at this point, or where is the distinction?
No, not quite. I'm still talking about desired outcomes. So, right. So going back to like the SpaceX example, right? They want to say, okay, we're going to lower that the cost per launch by to $100 per kilogram, right? And it's still a hypothesis. They think that number equates to solving the problem of people actually going into space, right? But if they got it down to $100 and they're like, oh, people still aren't going into space, they actually haven't solved that problem, right? So it's still hypothesis, it's still within that context. So even when you're talking about the desired outcome, you're still checking to see if that's true. The difference is that that's your focus, right? You've kind of put a value on that versus work where you're just trying to see like, what is the result of this work? Does that make sense? So I could say like, kind of going back to that example too, right? You design a new engine. And then the question is, well, did this lower the cost of space launch, right? And that not good or bad, you're just learning. So that's a validated outcome. But you have assigned a value to this desired outcome of this should lower the price of launch. We actually don't know yet if that solved the customer problem. We just think it does.
Okay.
Great question. I think that is a very complex distinction, and I think I'm still working through it a little bit myself. So I can think that one through and see if I can improve that one a bit. And I said this before, but I wanted to pull it out again. Right? Outcomes have nothing to do with products. right? An outcome has to do with solving a problem for a customer, right? And you can approach that in any number of different ways. I have an example here, but I am worried about time. So I may skip it, or I may go very quickly over it, right? Because I want to kind of illustrate that point. So this is, actually, I'll do it very quickly, right? So this is an Nissan Leaf. And if you ask me, is this valuable? Which happens a lot, right? You go into a review and you say, we did this work. Hey, is this valuable? Right? I might look at that and go, sure, that's valuable, right? It's electric. It's got some nice resale value. It's got some space. I can go around town with it, right? But then the question is, would I buy it? The answer is no, I wouldn't buy it. And the reason I wouldn't buy it is it doesn't actually solve my problems, right? The problems that I have, or the problems that I'm looking to solve right now, I like to go hike. And a lot of the hiking trails I like to do are at the end of these 4-wheel drive roads. I can't get there in this car, right? Or I've got my mountain bike. It would be really hard to get my mountain bike in that car. This really isn't the right car for me. So it kind of goes back to that thing again of like, for whom, right? For who are you trying to solve this problem for? For somebody else, this may be valuable. If you're trying to solve the problem for me, this is not, right? This doesn't make it. So I want to talk a little bit about how to use outputs to get to outcomes. And I do have an exercise. Alex, when do we need to cut off the conversation?
So the meeting we have is until 6:30. We should probably try to do as much as we can before 6, which gives us about 11 more minutes.
Okay.
So if you want to do a discussion, we should probably start it pretty soon.
Yeah, I would. And this is kind of building up to that. So how to use outputs to get to outcomes, right? So we often get an output figure, or we're told, we want you to deliver X amount of something, right? And that's not very exciting. That's not very interesting. So how do you actually take that and turn it into an outcome, right? The first is to ask why, and keep asking why, right? Why do you want that output? Why are we doing this thing in order to deliver this other thing, right? And what you're trying to ultimately get to is, how does this impact the customer in the end, right? If you're trying to increase delivery time, well, why are you doing that? How is that eventually going to help the customer with a problem that they have, right? So it's trying to kind of formulate it back to the origins. Again, kind of what I said, right? A business doesn't exist unless it's solving a problem for a customer. So what is it actually doing by improving these things? Another one is what, in addition to the outputs, is needed to solve the problem, right? A lot of times we deliver a piece of something, but we haven't actually solved the problem for the customer. So what's missing? How do we need to incorporate the remaining of what's going on to actually finish solving a problem for a customer? If that makes sense. I'm going a little bit fast here. And then kind of the question too of how can we find out if it solves the customer problem, right? Asking that question. Like, what is the step that we could take to validate that this is actually meaningful and helpful? So I did want to try a breakout room, see how this works. And this was the kind of the group conversation I was hoping to get to, right? And I want to take a really common example here of something that happens. And it's okay if you don't have a real example, or maybe you don't know, you can make it up. That's totally fine. This is a pretty small group, so this will be interesting. Right, so your hypothetical manager gives you an output goal, right? Increase team velocity by 10%. I think we can probably relate to that one. How could you take that, right? That idea of, okay, you're asking us for 10%. How can you turn that into a desired outcome? And then just kind of a reminder there on this slide of like, how you might be able to approach that problem of taking that question and turning it into something meaningful. How do we want to do this, Alex? Because I was expecting a few more people here.
Yeah, we did have some people drop, so let's just keep it in the main room here and go right into the discussion.
Okay.
So yeah, let's pretend we're going into discussions now. So everybody, we're thinking about this situation. A manager gives us an output goal of increasing team velocity by 10%. That brings me pain to read that. And then we're going to try to create a meaningful desired outcome from that. So everybody will start calling things like 9 points instead of 8 points, or 11 points instead of 10 points, and we solve the problem. But it's still not an outcome, but that is a way to solve the problem. So how do we get an outcome from that? Anyone experience this?
Well, I think we've all experienced it. Whether or not we came up with a meaningful desired outcome out of it, though, is, well, the jury's still out on that one. Yeah, I think you see this repeated over and over again, where they just ask for more, they being management, out of the teams, or even just one team. And it's like, well, you can keep squeezing them, but that doesn't mean that they're going to actually, you're probably going to give up something in quality. You know, because you know, like, is the capacity there, you know, to actually allow for this? But, you know, I'm trying to look down at these questions, and the first one here says, ask why, and then keep asking why. So should the question be back to the manager? Why? Is that what you're saying? Why am I doing this? Or should the question be why internal to the team?
Yeah, I think that's a great question back to the manager. Like, why do they want that? Why do you think they might want higher velocity?
Well, because they believe that it'll create more throughput, but but again, like I say, there's gonna be a sacrifice there, most likely.
So let me follow.
Unless they weren't producing at the velocity that they were expected to.
So let me
when I've seen this situation, often drivers tend to be, partly because of the construct of the larger system, which is invariably business and IT. And IT holds the budget, and business says this is what we want to do, and IT says this is how much it's going to cost. And it's like, well, do more so we get more for our money. So it's a internal financial driver. That's a common one, which is just change the construct, because, like, you know, that's just bad, drives all sorts of bad behaviors. But quite often also it's like, we want to get more out sooner because we want to increase revenue, or we want to increase market share, or, you know, which is an outcome, but it's an outcome for the business. It's not an outcome for the customer. And that is based on the belief of, the more we build, the more they'll come. And often that's not the case, which is because that goes back to the desired outcome with an assumption versus the actual reality of what customers want. But it's driven by that wrong belief of, if we get more stuff out there, then we'll get more customers, which means more market share, more revenue, more profit, blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff. So that's a common. And if you ask why enough, you get down to those kind of areas, and then it's like, yeah, it doesn't work like that. Look after the customer, and then they'll come, and then we build what the customer wants. Now even more will come. But that's that change in mindset. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the gaming is the common one. It's just like, yeah, sure, we'll bump up all of our estimates by 1 point, and hey, our velocity's gone up. It's not a bad thing, because then the manager goes, but nothing's changed. We're still getting the same amount of stuff out at the same time. It's like, now you're getting into the realms of understanding what it is that you're trying to get out of this.
So I love what I'm actually hearing, right? Because we're actually peeling back all these layers, and it is extremely confusing. But right, the first why was, well, they want more throughput. Well, why do they want more throughput? Well, they want to get more software out. Why do they want that? Because they think it's going to generate more revenue if they have more software out there, right? And why do they think that? Right? Well, they think that if we have more software out there, customers are more likely to buy our products. Right. And why do they think that? Right. And I think that's where we're actually starting to get to, well, what's actually kind of driving, and this is purely hypothetical, but what's actually driving all of this? Like, right. Essentially, there's a fundamental belief that customers aren't getting enough of something for what they're paying for. Right. And so now we're starting to kind of circle around, well, what's the actual thing that the customer needs in order to actually buy our products? Because that's really the goal here, right? It's gone through all of these abstraction levels, and someone along the line says throughput, that'll solve the problem. But really the problem is customers aren't buying the product, right? And I think that's where we're hopefully getting to, is like, okay, so why aren't the customers actually buying the product, right? What's actually missing? Because just more, we know just more isn't going to solve it. So what's actually missing? What do they need? Right? Any other thoughts on this?
That series of questions is good, and it also is, industry and product dependent, right? So we're talking about some company building a product that customers out there will buy, some mass-produced whatever. Trent and I come from government contracting, where oftentimes, the government customer is your customer, and they, you're building something for them years at a time. And oftentimes when you would get asked, and I've been asked this by managers, why is the velocity going down for your team, or how can we increase this? It's for two reasons. One is they're doing an Agile implementation, and they're told that when you do Agile, you're constantly improving. So they think, okay, cool, let's just factor that into our projections. Our velocity is going to increase 10% every quarter, which, what I don't know why they think that that's what it is, but that's what they do. And so part of it is the misunderstanding of what Agile is they think you're going to constantly increase that. So that's where that's coming from. But another very common reason is there's a lot of pressure to deliver, and tons of programs within government contracting go over budget, over schedule. And so you're already in a position where you're delivering late, you're spending way too much money. So you're trying to buy that back and say, how can we increase velocity to get back there so that you can get on the good graces of the customer, so the customer doesn't pull funding, so that I can get more work. That's the kind of trail of questions when you would start asking that, what that filters out of the team of increase your velocity by 10%. That's the driving factor.
Yeah. So the customer problem there is, right, a lack of faith in your ability to deliver on time and on budget. Yeah.
I think this situation also brings up an interesting view of how cultures within organizations work. Because essentially what this is saying is, we're not going to tell you what the problem is, or if we do tell you what the problem is, maybe it's not particularly well communicated, but we're going to tell you what we think the solution is. And it it's not just velocity. I mean, there's a whole number of things that are thrown at teams as, we want to see X, whether it's increased velocity or predictability. And I know you said that that's not a good thing earlier on. Within context, I think it's a good thing. But we want to see this solution, not this is. And often I don't understand the problem. And then what happens is like you get behaviors responding to solutions which aren't the right solution to a problem, and then nothing changes, and then it's more of the same because that's what people know. And it's actually shifting heads out of, and it's human nature trying to go to a solution rather than understanding what the problem is. And then you get into the realms of, like management should be, how can we help you solve this problem rather than this is what we want you to do this solution. So it's a cultural thing as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I really agree with what you just said there. And I think that's fundamental to talking about great outcomes, right? I think a lot of what I've talked about is that there's this kind of embedded idea of, we actually don't know the answer, right? That's part of what we're doing, is we're trying to figure it out. We have a good idea of where we want to go, but we don't have the answers, and we're trying to discover those solutions, right? Which is very, very different than, well, I know the answer, right? And right, output has its place, right? If you're talking about, you just need to manufacture more screws and that equals more business, then you probably don't need to do a whole lot of exploration and innovation. You just need to pump out screws and output is fine, right? But if you're trying to solve real problems, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like this idea of pretending or thinking that you have the answer early on is part of the reasons we get these output metrics instead of outcomes. That's a really good point. I'm sitting here writing down right now, like, how could I add this in? Or that's a really good point. All right, so we are at 6. I have one slide left, and it is my outcome validation moment, right? So this is my intention, where the problem I'm trying to solve, right? Business culture kind of sucks a lot more than it should. I think that's a problem because, or I think that problem exists because businesses measure success based on internally focused output goals that have nothing to do with their customers, and it makes the work of employees feel meaningless. So I already gave you a little bit of an idea of what I'm hoping to get out of this presentation, right? I'm hoping that my stories and interaction around outputs and outcomes will allow you to walk away with a greater sense of purpose to improve this. Hopefully gave you some new skills, and I hope you enjoyed it. So this is my moment. Now I get to find out, did I actually do that? And there is a link here to a form that for some reason I can't seem to figure out the permissions for, but if I can share this with you, I'd love you to potentially use this as well. Can you let me know if this link works for anybody?
It's still giving me a permission error.
That is so annoying. I have no idea why.
It says it's form can only be viewed by users in the owner's organization. So maybe an organization-wide, drive-wide setting. I'm not sure.
It could be, yeah.
Okay, Amelia seeing the same thing.
On their board, whether it's a Scrum or a Kanban board, before done, they have the validation of the deliverable. So many teams just go deploy, 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 deploy. Next, like, does it make a difference? Somebody else's problem to worry about. And if it is, that's fine. But somebody somewhere should be thinking about it, and hopefully closer to the team and closer to the customer. But I think it's a good thing to have it on a board, because it visualizes the need to keep thinking about that kind of a thing.
It's ironic for me to see that you're kind of comparing outcomes versus output, and it was just like in August when I did a lunch and learn with my company on this exact topic, outcomes versus output, but how, because you hear that constantly, like, oh, you got to focus on outcomes. You got to focus on outcomes. Don't focus on output. And I'm like, that's great, but you need to tell people how to do that. How do you focus on outcomes? And that's essentially the same thing you're doing here, is saying this is how you focus on outcomes, and how you get to where you're outcome focused is, I think part of your point is that, you have to have a validation of a hypothesis, or an invalidation of a hypothesis, as it were, and an acceptance of it, regardless of whether it's a validation or an invalidation. And then realizing that if it is an invalidation, well, now you probably got to go back and do some more work on your hypothesis, and maybe create a new hypothesis, and then go and attempt to validate or invalidate that, and just kind of repeat that process, but making sure that you're staying customer focused. Because if you're building the wrong thing, building it right, but you're building the wrong thing, then you're just wasting your time, you're wasting your money, you're wasting resources. And so that's where I got, you were talking about various speakers and authors and whatnot that you've been honing in on lately. I got onto Jonathan Smart's Better Value, Sooner, Safer, Happier. And he talks a lot about like effective patterns, things that you can do. Like we hear about anti-patterns, but it's like, well, what about the effective patterns? What are the right things that we should do? And in most cases, it's probably the opposite of whatever the anti-patterns are. But I just, I found his book to be very inspiring to talk about how do you get to those outcomes? How do you, get to better value and do it sooner, and do it without destroying the morale and the culture of your company. Because, if you destroy that, then, eventually they'll stop putting out value, or they'll never start it. So.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's sad. I've actually seen an organization that was extremely outcome oriented, and I just want to call out, I think the point that you said about customer centricity is really important, right? That it's not just validating a hypothesis, it's validating a customer centric hypothesis. And yeah, I watched a great company that used to do that, and then kind of lost their way. And it's challenging when you have leadership that is not customer oriented, right? They're really focused on internal business needs, and it becomes really difficult, right? And you start going, well, why do you want this? What's actually going on? Right? And then people start disconnecting more and more, kind of like I was saying in my story, right? People have a natural tendency to find success in what's being measured, and that's not a very compelling thing after a while. Well, yeah, I got your message about how to fix the survey. I'm trying to do that right now. I'm hoping it works. Let's see. I'm in settings.
Well, I have a question while you do that then, and it's for Trent and Alex. So working in a government setting, how do you manage this challenge when like you are essentially building something for a client, but there are end users that, let's say you've interviewed and you're engaging with, and you do want them to validate what you're building?
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question? I don't think I quite followed. In an
Okay.
interview? Oh, then like a review? Product
No,
review?
no. So I'm saying in a government setting, you have the client, right? That you're going to build something for. So
Mhm.
ultimately, they're kind of asking you what they want. And there are end users to whatever you're building that are not necessarily that client, right? They're just other users of the system. So I'm wondering, when we talk about validating customer-centric hypotheses, how do you do that in a government setting where you're, you know, the client is someone who potentially will not use it?
And that's the $1 million question.
Well, just like any stories you all have about what you've experienced would be nice to hear.
Yeah, well, and so in most cases, especially with DoD contracts, you're dealing with an acquisitions office, and they're defining all the requirements, they're designing the whole system, and then they're gonna, you know, find some contractor to go and do their biddings for them, right? Basically, you know, build out some system, and so we're generally one or two, many steps removed from whoever the actual end user is and who's going to be the recipient of that system. So, you know, we're, you know, Alex and I work on contracts where we do whatever we can to get ourselves in touch with those actual end users, but it's not easy. It's one of those things where typically those end users are people who are, you know, they're operators of some major defense system that their bosses aren't just willing to give them up. Right? They're not willing to say, hey, can you go give an assessment on whatever this product is that this company's been developing under this acquisitions contract? You know, they're very protective of those folks, and they're like, okay, we'll give you 1 day a quarter. Does that work? And you're like, well, I guess if that's all you're willing to give us, then we'll take it, because otherwise, you know, we can't get their perspectives elsewhere. You know, I can't just go out to the general public and say, hey, what do you think about this defense system? I'm not going to get the right feedback. So yeah, it's a challenge that we pretty much encounter on a daily basis, you know, because we're just not talking to the right people. You know, I can talk to the people that are the acquisitions officers, and they're like, well, this is exactly what we think they need. I'm like, were you ever an operator before? Well, no, I just graduated the academy last year. Well, that's fantastic. So you don't actually know anything about the system or the mission or the ConOps, you know. So anyway, I can go on and on.
One thing that springs to mind as a potential, I wouldn't necessarily call it a solution. I mean, it can be, but it's certainly a mitigator. And you know, in Trent's case, it's some things, you know, are just so big and so what's the word? You can't test them up front until you've actually got something out there, you know, in a defense space. But in a, you know, if you're looking at government organizations, they exist for the service of the public, in theory. That's the idea, at least anyway. Some governments not so good as others, but when a government department goes to a provider and says, hey, we want this, if, and there's a very big if, particularly with government, you can get them to go through a process up front, and I'm thinking human-centered design. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, but it's a structured, formal approach to tackle a hypothesis and a bunch of assumptions in a way that directly interacts with the presumed target audience to get sufficient feedback to then give you enough information to be able to make informed decisions about what you do, whether you persevere or not, and what it is that you seek to provide as a solution. And having that up front, like I say, it's a big if, would then give you, we want this based on this human-centered design outputs rather than an assumption. And it narrows very much the risk that you face in terms of getting something that people aren't going to use or is even delivered to the wrong target audience. I mean, an example that springs to mind is, we've got a crime problem. Well, that's because we've got a drug problem. Well, that's because we've got low socioeconomic problem. So maybe we target, increasing socio-economic issues and then the ripple effect. But if you try and address the crime problem directly, it's kind of like trying to stick your finger in a leaking dike. Yeah, so human-centered design, but the big if is, going to government saying, hey, do all this stuff up front. They go, no, we know what we want, and we're just going to go to contracts and get them to provide it. But, that's a different problem.
And Melia, just to chime in a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, as Trent said, that when you're in government defense contracting, you're dealing with an acquisition office, not the end users, not the people that are operating the actual product that you're delivering. And so the sad truth is sometimes it doesn't matter if you have that end user feedback. The people that are actually using the system, they're not making the funding decisions, and so they don't usually have a vote. However, sometimes they do, and it depends contract to contract and program to program. And even if you don't, even if they don't really have a direct kind of funding or a direct ear to the customer, the actual people that are funding the program, one thing you can try to do is, and I think Trent knows about this as well, some programs will do operator feedback days, or try to get the operators in the room once a month, once every couple of weeks, whatever you can do to get the actual end users in to explore the latest round of what you've released or intend to release. And if you can't do that, then you can do pseudo operators. Say it's something that hasn't been delivered yet. You can create pseudo operators, people that have either operated it before or have UI UX expertise, and they can go in and provide their feedback as you go and incrementally deliver. And then you can show to the people that are funding, so that customer, you can show to them that, hey, this has passed the latest round of pseudo operators, and they've provided the following feedback. We've made the following adjustments. Those are some things to do, but yeah, the sad truth is on some programs it doesn't matter, even though it should. But those are some ways to incorporate it.
I appreciate that. I just started a role and I'm working on a government contract, and it's a DoD one, but it's non-defense. So it's, I think, a bit easier than maybe what some of you all have been, or like non-weapons related. But yeah, I think it's definitely challenging to think about like how you would do something differently. And then knowing they're coming to you because they want Agile software, like software development, but you can't get your hands on the right people. Or in some ways, I've been lucky enough to try to figure out who end users would be, because they'll most likely be analysts. But then this idea that you all have around the pseudo operators, or even having operator feedback days, will probably help me a lot in the upcoming weeks. So I appreciate that insight.
If I can offer my perspective too, because I've kind of gone through this process as well of kind of working with kind of like a pseudo government product owner who wasn't actually talking to their customers and didn't really understand their customers either. And one of the ways that I kind of broached that, it was I did the same kinds of things that I would do with a real person to understand their pains and gains and that kind of thing, but I would do it with them, right? And I kind of identify all the different personas that might be out there. And what that did was expose all the things they didn't know, right? And it made it really clear why this was a challenge. I also got my team's buy-in because they really wanted to know too, so they could build better solutions. But that was kind of an interesting way of showing the government person that I was working with, like why this is a problem, why we actually need to get those operators or those real users into the room and have those real conversations. And at the same time, right, I was kind of teaching them how they could do this themselves.
Thank you.
Trent just texted me that his computer froze on him, so that's why he just suddenly dropped. All right. Well, Mike, anything else that you want to bring up before we part?
No, I just want to say thank you again. Thank you for showing up for the second time that this was held. I know that was annoying when people tried to show up last time and couldn't get in. And I just really appreciate it, right? Like this was I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed having this conversation. Again, this is like the first time I've done a real presentation like this. So it's exciting for me, and you made me feel welcome. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mike. And speaking on the topic, for those that haven't clicked it, go ahead and click that survey and you can fill that out. And then Mike will get that data as he iterates over this presentation. And again, go see the job board if you have anything to share there. And I think that's it.
Yeah, if you did like this, I may be presenting this at Agile Boulder in February. Like I said, your feedback is appreciated because I will use it. If you didn't like it, then I'll pick another topic.
I think it's a valuable topic. It's definitely I was going to say a nut that needs cracking, but I think it's more of a case of a nut that needs chipping away at, because it's just endemic in too many places. So yeah, thank you for doing it. It was interesting. I popped a link and a image in the chat, a link to the technical report that I mentioned, and an updated image for the Heart of Agile logo.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In the Google Doc, if you go down to the bottom of the Google Doc is the updated image, one cool. That has the dialogue and humanity in there.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So, all right, thanks a lot, folks.
All right, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night.